From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now! It was the night of June 9th, 2006, when 3 Guantanamo prisoners mysteriously died.
They are smart, they are creative, they are committed. They have no regard in life, neither ours nor their own. I believe this was not an act of desperation, rather an act of asymmetric warfare waged against us.
The Pentagon said the Guantanamo prisoners committed suicide. But were the prisoners actually tortured to death at a secret CIA black site? Today, in a broadcast exclusive, we'll speak with Joseph Hickman. He served as staff sergeant at the base. He's just published a book titled Murder at Camp Delta. Then, Women on Waves.
So we built a mobile clinic so we could sail to international waters and legally help women with a safe abortion.
To the harbor. We are here in solidarity with women who have been denied their human rights.
The new film Vessel looks at how a Dutch doctor managed to open access to safe abortion in countries where the procedure is illegal. We'll speak with Dr. Rebecca Gompertz of Women on Waves in Amsterdam and filmmaker Diana Whitten. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. New satellite images and witness accounts have emerged of what Amnesty International calls the catastrophic destruction from a massacre in northern Nigeria. Hundreds are feared dead after Boko Haram militants attacked Baga and surrounding areas earlier this month. Before and after images taken of 2 adjacent towns show thousands of buildings damaged or destroyed. Amnesty says one town was completely wiped off the map. One witness who managed to flee told Amnesty, quote, "I don't know how many, but there were bodies everywhere we looked." The Nigerian military has claimed a toll as low as 150, but it could be as high as 2,000 dead. Amnesty said, quote, "Of all Boko Haram assaults analyzed by Amnesty International, this is the largest and most destructive yet, a deliberate attack on civilians whose homes, clinics, and schools are now burnt-out ruins." An underground Belgium arms dealer has turned himself into police in Brussels, saying he sold the weapons to the gunmen in last week's Paris attacks. French authorities have also reportedly identified the accomplice of Amadi Coulibaly, who killed 4 in a kosher supermarket. The news comes hours after al-Qaeda took responsibility for the Charlie Hebdo massacre, saying it was ordered by top leader Ayman Zawahiri. On Wednesday, Charlie Hebdo published its first issue since the attack, featuring a cover of the Prophet Muhammad holding a sign that reads, "Je suis Charlie," or "I am Charlie," with the headline, "All is forgiven." The issue was published in 5 countries with a print run of 5 million copies, up from the magazine's normal circulation of 60,000. The Islamic State has launched a series of new attacks across Iraq, killing dozens of people. According to Al Jazeera, at least 16 Kurdish Peshmerga soldiers were killed today in an ISIS offensive on the Mosul Dam. Other attacks were reported in the town of Sinjar and another flashpoint area in Diyala province. The Pentagon says the U.S.-led coalition carried out 12 strikes on ISIS positions inside Iraq overnight. General John Allen, the U.S. envoy for the global coalition, said Iraq is on the front lines of the campaign against ISIS following the recent attacks in Paris and other Western cities.
As we saw so tragically in Paris last week, Iraq is on the front lines of a global conflict. I was in Paris last week meeting with French and European counterparts as the crisis there was unfolding. And it was a stark reminder that Daesh's dark, violent ideology has a long reach. Even before Paris, we saw terrorists inspired by Daesh wreak havoc in other capitals of the coalition, in Sydney, and in Ottawa, and in Brussels.
The United Nations has issued a new appeal for Syrian refugees as a harsh winter sets in. The UN Refugee Agency says 2/3 of Syrian refugees in Jordan are now living below the absolute poverty line of $96 per month. A UNICEF spokesperson said more children are endangered by the day.
The number of vulnerable children, as I said, children in need, has been growing on a daily basis. Planning has been extremely challenging due to the increasing numbers of families moving to informal settlements. More and more displaced Syrians have run out of savings and are now having to resort to desperate measures, including moving to settlements as a last resort.
5 Yemeni prisoners have been freed from the U.S. military prison at Guantanamo. 4 were sent to Oman, where another will go to Estonia, the first time either country has agreed to take in former Guantanamo prisoners. The 5 have been cleared for release for many years, but the U.S. has refused to send them to Yemen. The Pentagon says there are now 122 prisoners left at Guantanamo. An Ohio man has been arrested for an alleged plot to attack the U.S. Capitol that authorities say was inspired by the Islamic State. An FBI informant said Christopher Cornell planned to set off pipe bombs and open fire on congressional officials and staffers. Investigators reportedly started tracking Cornell after he expressed support for violent jihad on Twitter. Federal prosecutors in Mexico have formally charged the mayor of Iguala for the kidnapping of 43 students in late September. Police had accused Jose Luis Abarca and his wife of spearheading the attack, but it's the first time he's been indicted. The students were allegedly abducted by local police working with drug gangs, and according to one report, possibly federal forces as well. Parents of the disappeared students, meanwhile, have launched a civilian search in the region of Guerrero, where these students were last seen. Hundreds of people, including members of community police forces, Ayotzinapa students and members of civil society, are scouring rural areas where they've received tips that the students may be held captive. Emiliano Navarrete, the father of one of the missing students, is helping coordinate the search.
I personally have gone to more than 100 places to look for my son, and we haven't found them, not even one of the students. From my perspective, it is because the government, the military, is holding them. This was all planned by them, including the governor. The government definitely knows where they are, but they don't want to give us the answer. This enrages me as a Mexican. I am embarrassed when I realize what government exists and what kind of government we have here in Guerrero State.
And the Republican-controlled House of Representatives here in the United States has voted to undo major portions of President Obama's executive action on immigration. The measure would strip the legal protections offered to millions of undocumented immigrants as part of a reprieve granted last year. More than 24 Republicans broke with their party to oppose the measure. President Obama has promised a veto if it reaches his desk. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. 13 years ago this month, the United States opened its notorious prison at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. At its peak, nearly 800 men were held there. Today, the prison population has dipped to 122. On Wednesday, the Pentagon announced 5 more prisoners, all of them Yemeni, would be released. 4 of the men were transferred to Oman and the 5th to Estonia. Today, we're going to look at one of the great mysteries of Guantanamo, what happened on the night of June 9th, 2006, when 3 prisoners died there. Authorities at Guantanamo said the 3 men, Yasir Talal al-Zahrani, Salah Ahmad al-Salami, and Mani Shamam al-Utaibi, all committed suicide. The commander at Guantanamo, Rear Admiral Harry Harris, described their deaths as, quote, an act of asymmetrical warfare.
They are smart, they are creative, they are committed. They have no regard in life, neither ours nor their own. I believe this was not an act of desperation, rather an act of asymmetric warfare waged against us.
But many questions about the night remain unanswered. Harper's Magazine contributing editor Scott Horton first raised questions about what happened on that night in a 2000 piece he wrote called The Guantanamo Suicides. For the piece, Horton won a National Magazine Award for reporting. He appeared on Democracy Now! At the time, questioning the findings of the Naval Criminal Investigation Service, or NCIS, which investigated the deaths.
We were able to see how they had concluded the suicides occurred. And they state that these 3 prisoners bound their feet, bound their hands with cloth, stuffed cloth down their throats, in some cases at least put masks over their faces to hold the cloth in place, fashioned mannequins of themselves to put in their beds to deceive the guards, put up cloth to obstruct the view of cameras, fashioned a noose which they attached at the top of an 8-foot wire wall, stepped up as their hands and feet are bound and they're gagging on cloth, stepped up on top of a wash basin, put their head through the noose, tightened it, and jumped off. And moreover, that these 3 prisoners in non-adjacent cells did all of these things absolutely simultaneously in a clockwork-like fashion. So the story is just simply incredible and simply not believable, I should stress.
That was reporter and attorney Scott Horton speaking in 2010.
Horton went on to reveal the 3 men who died may have been interrogated that night at a secret CIA black site facility at Guantanamo known as Camp No, or Penny Lane. Horton based his reporting on Guantanamo in part on testimony from a whistleblower, Staff Sergeant Joseph Hickman, who was on guard that night at Camp Delta. Hickman has spent most of his life in the military. He was awarded the Army Achievement Medal and the Army Commendation Medal while he was stationed with the 629th Military Intelligence Battalion in Guantanamo Bay. He was praised for dealing with a prison revolt in May 2006 when, by his own estimation, he became the first U.S. soldier to give the order to fire on prisoners at Guantanamo Bay.
Staff Sergeant Joseph Hickman has just published a book about the deaths. It's titled Murder at Camp Delta, a staff sergeant's pursuit of the truth about Guantanamo Bay. Since leaving the military, Joseph Hickman began working as an independent researcher for the Seton Hall University School of Law's Center for Policy and Research. He's joining us from Green Bay, Wisconsin. And we're joined here in New York by the director of the center, Seton Hall professor Mark Denbo. The center's just published a new report titled Guantanamo, America's Battle Lab. Joseph Hickman, thanks so much for being with us. Can you talk about that night, the night of June 9th, 2006? Talk about what you saw.
On June 9th, I was what was called Sergeant of the Guard. I was in charge of many different places in Guantanamo, different posts that were being manned by other soldiers. And one of my posts that I was in charge of was the towers in Camp Delta. So I went to visit the guards that were manning those posts, and I went up to the tower, and when I was up there, I saw a vehicle, a van, we called it the paddy wagon, pull into Camp Delta and back up to the entrance of Camp 1. From there, I saw the driver get out and his assistant go to Alpha Block, take a detainee out of Alpha Block and put him in the paddy wagon. They then drove off, left Camp Delta, made a quick right, and then a left that headed down the road out of the camps, out of Camp America, which Camp America housed the camps at the time. About 20 minutes later, the paddy wagon came back, and it repeated the same thing. It backed up to Camp 1. The two people in the paddy wagon went to Alpha Block, grabbed another detainee, put him in there, and went the same route. At this time, I started to get suspicious, wondering where he was going. So 20 minutes later, they came back a third time. This time, when they backed up to 1, I knew they were getting another detainee, but I wanted to see where that paddy wagon was going exactly. So I left and went to the entrance in Camp America, which is called ACP Roosevelt, Access Auto Control Point Roosevelt. And when the van finally did pass that checkpoint, If it went straight, it was going to the main base. But 100 meters past the checkpoint, it made a left, which meant it was going to either two places. You could only go to two places in 2006 at that time. You could go to the beach, or you could go to a place that we called, as soldiers there, Camp No.
No, as in N-O.
As in no, it's not there, and no, it does not exist.
A black site.
Yes.
What did you know about the site when you first came across it that night, on June 9th, 2006?
I knew a little bit about it beforehand. We didn't know much at all at the time. We discovered it while we were on a mobile patrol one day when we stopped to take a break, me and a couple other soldiers. I'll actually never forget the day, because when we stopped, it was hot. We just wanted to take a break and find some shade under some brush. And when we did stop, we noticed a fence in Constantine wire. So we got close to it to see what was there. Me and another soldier that was in the Humvee with me at the time. And when we went up to the fence, we could actually see the buildings of Camp No. And they looked exactly like a detainee facility, like Camp Echo or Camp. It was constructed the same way. So we just knew it was a detainee facility. It was a KBR building, it looked like. And I just remember the guy I was with, the guard I was with, he just said, you know what we just found? And I said, what do you think it is? And he said, we just found our Auschwitz. And I'll never forget that day, and I'll never forget when he said that.
What gave him the impression? Why did he say Auschwitz?
Well, it was obvious to us it was a detainee holding facility that was completely off the books.
So talk about what happened later that night, Joseph Hickman. Now we're talking about, I guess, June 10th. It was the night of June 9th. What happened to those three prisoners? You saw uncharacteristically in metal handcuffs, is that right, when they were taken away as opposed to plastic cuffs?
Well, they were handcuffed. The one thing that I noticed after I saw them leave the camps, the rest of the night went pretty quiet until around 11:30, when the paddy wagon returned. But instead of going to Camp 1, it went to the detainee medical clinic. And it backed up to the detainee medical clinic entrance and opened its back doors, where I didn't have a visual after they opened the back doors because I couldn't see through them, and it appeared they were loading something into the medical clinic. About just 15, 20 minutes later at the most, all the lights come on. And sirens are going off. It's complete panic in the camps. And I didn't know what was going on, but I went down, I saw a corpsman. I'd left the tower and saw a corpsman standing in front of the medical clinic. It was a corpsman that I knew. So I went up to her and I asked her, hey, what's going on? She said, 3 detainees killed themselves. They stuffed rags down their throats. So right there, a few minutes later, I'm not sure how many minutes later, but I saw Colonel Baumgartner, and he told me we're going to have a meeting at right after work at 0700 at the theater. I want everybody there. Everybody who have on duty, I want them there.
And so far as you're aware, Joseph Hickman, how long was Camp No in operation? And what happened to the facility after these 3 men died?
Well, personally, all I can tell you is it was open. It was there from March 2006 to March 2007. I don't know how often they had detainees there or how often it was manned, but I know I would say from when we discovered it, sometime in April to to June when I saw them go to Camp No. It was operational then. Later on, other people have reported that it was open. It closed sometime in 2006.
And so, Sergeant Hickman, what happened at that meeting that you were all called to attend?
Well, Colonel Baumgartner, everybody was there that was on duty that night. Colonel Baumgartner got in front of everyone and he said, three detainees committed suicide last night. They shoved rags down their throats. But you're going to hear something different on the media, from the media. And he said, you are not to speak to anyone at home. You are not to speak to, you're not to write letters about this. Remember, we are monitoring you, or NSA's monitoring you. And he gave us a direct order not to speak about the suicides.
There were 4 reporters on the base at the time?
There was reporters on the base. They were told to leave the base immediately. They weren't allowed to stick around after the deaths.
Did you start to ask questions right away?
I started to ask questions the next day when I saw Admiral Harris on CNN. And I mean, right away it was suspicious with Colonel Baumgartner, but when Admiral Harris got on the news, when I was sitting in the chow hall watching CNN, and Admiral Harris called it asymmetrical warfare and said they hung themselves, I knew right away that no one hung themselves in Camp 1. It was completely impossible. From my standpoint, from the guards under me that were serving in that area, no one saw any detainees transferred from Camp 1 to the medical clinic. It just did not happen.
So what'd you do?
Well, I waited. I waited because I knew that there was going to be an investigation. I knew NCIS was investigating the deaths. So I waited for them to come interview me, and I would tell them what I saw. And that day never came. NCIS never interviewed the guards that were in the towers in the area, or the Sallyport guards that were literally 25 meters away at most from the medical clinic. They never interviewed any of us.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. We're talking to Joseph Hickman, former Army Staff Sergeant stationed at Guantanamo from March 2006 to March 2007. His book, Murder at Camp Delta, has just been published. This is his first broadcast interview. We'll be back in a moment. Sati, Nocien #1. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Our guests are Joseph Hickman, former Army Staff Sergeant, stationed at Guantanamo for a year, beginning in March of 2006. He's just published a new book. It's called Murder at Camp Delta, a staff sergeant's pursuit of the truth about Guantanamo Bay. We're also joined by Mark Dembo, professor at Seton Hall University School of Law and the director of its Center for Policy and Research, co-author of a new report, Guantanamo, America's Battle Lab.
So, Mark Denbo, you've worked on this issue of what happened that night of June 9th, 2006 in Guantanamo for many years. You've also worked with Joseph Hickman on this. And your research center has just come out with a new report called Guantanamo, America's Battle Lab. Could you lay out what you find in this report?
Yeah. Our investigation over this period of time first found that the NCIS report could not have been a credible, legitimate process. So our next question was, and we published something on that called Death at Camp Delta. The next question was, how could it have been so incompetent? It was one thing, as a student said, to imagine people who killed people would want to cover it up, but why would investigative bodies cover up deaths? And we did, our second report was called Uncovering the Cover-Ups, which came out last summer. But the real question still was, what's the motive? And it turns out that the motive that we found, which was before the Senate report came out, was quite clear that the general in charge of the camp had been placed there by the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in February of 2002. The general who thought he was in charge of the camp, a General Baucus, who was an MP, who was applying the Geneva Convention, a general in charge of detention, an MP. And he, as a general in charge of detention, he was applying the Geneva Conventions. He was removed, and General Dunleavy replaced him, followed by General Miller. General Dunleavy has, under oath, said that he got his marching orders directly from the President of the United States, requiring him to meet in person once a week with Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. And General Dunleavy and his successor, General Miller, have both repeatedly characterized Guantanamo as America's battle lab.
And what does that mean?
Well, the best thing that we've been able to figure out when we started that phrase caught everybody's attention. And so the first thing that we looked into was, what were the experiments there? And we were able to find and discover some of the laboratory experiments were there, including giving them drugs that would cause psychotic breaks for up to 30 days as soon as they arrived, and a variety of other things that were given to them over a long period of time.
Which had never been used in any other context before.
The drug they used, they claimed, was to help with malaria. However, there is no malaria in Guantanamo, there is no malaria in Cuba, and every person who was brought there had already had a medical examination in Afghanistan and was proven to have no contagious diseases. So it was a psychotic, really inducing drug, which had been used for a considerable period of time by other sources in order to break down the state of mind of the people.
Professor Denbo, you're saying that this camp was used to experiment on people?
Yes. That's what General Dunleavy referred to when he referred to it as America's battle lab. That's what General Miller was referring to when he described Guantanamo as America's battle lab, and he was Dunleavy's successor. The only question was, what were the experiments? And of course, the question became fairly clear once we discovered this giving of these psychotic-inducing drugs. They gave them the minute people arrived.
So go back to that night of June 9th,
Yes.
2006 into June 10th.
Yes.
We've just heard Staff Sergeant Joseph Hickman describe what he saw as the prisoners were taken away. What did you come to understand?
Well, he contacted us 3 days after President Obama was inaugurated with describing something that seemed implausible. It was simply counterintuitive to imagine that these people had died as he reported them. And we spent 2 days interviewing him, and we were still somewhat skeptical. And our students then took the NCIS report that had come out, which was 1,700 pages of jumbled, redacted doctrines, and went through it. And it took them 3 months to go through it. And they would make little discoveries that would sort of support Joseph's position. One was they all had rigor mortis when they came in the clinic. Well, how could you have rigor mortis if you're hanging in a cell being watched by 5 guards, or there are 24 people being watched by 5 guards, and they were supposed to see them every 3 minutes? Once they found that, the students sort of began to peel layers away. They discovered the only guards who had ever reported that the detainees were dead hanging in their cells prior to making that statement had been formally advised they had their Miranda rights, they'd made false statements prior to that, and that if they had a right to counsel and a right to remain silent. Instead, they repeated the story that Admiral Harris had said 4 days earlier. One of my students said, why would you have every one of the witnesses to the event have to have a formal Miranda warning document that they had to sign? And another student said, well, if they've made false statements to NCIS before that, where are the false statements in the file? And when nobody could find those false statements, it just led to information piling up after piling up. And I think that we used to joke, we had a student named Kelly, and if Kelly was from Kansas, and our view was if Kelly would buy a hostile negative conclusion, then it had to be true. And Kelly ended up concluding that they didn't hang themselves in their cells, and if they didn't, they couldn't be suicide. And so Kelly from Kansas ended up convincing everybody on the group that we had to at least go so far as to say the NCIS investigation was not credible, and then she ended up coming up with the title called Death in Camp Delta. Nobody wanted to call it murder, because we didn't know, but nobody could believe it was suicide, so their compromise, trying to be careful, was Death in Camp Delta. And we brought that to Scott Horton with Joe Hickman, and Scott then went further and took the entire investigation and did the first report.
Yeah, so when Scott Horton's Harper's piece first appeared, called The Guantanamo Suicides, it was published in January 2010, it came under some criticism. The piece was, of course, based in large part on Joseph Hickman's testimony. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service said in response to the piece, quote, according to the Harper's article, Sergeant Hickman was stationed on the exterior perimeter of the camp, including Tower 1, the night of the detainees' deaths. From this location, he had no visibility into the cell block and cells where the deaths occurred, a fact confirmed by FBI and DOJ investigators who were specifically tasked to look into Sergeant Hickman's allegations. NCIS conducted over 100 interviews during the first 3 days of the investigation, including interviews with all the guards who worked in the cell block that day and all the detainees who were housed there. None of those interviewed told of any detainees being taken away or alleged homicide. Joseph Hickman, could you respond to that criticism of what they say you were able to witness or see then that night, June 9th, 2006?
Sure. One thing, the NCIS, on their response, they told at best a half-truth about where I was and what my duties were. Yes, I did have responsibilities on the perimeter of Camp Delta, but I also had responsibilities inside Camp Delta. And actually probably more than 50% of my time was spent inside of the camp, where they tried to say he was just a perimeter guard, where the other time I was spent outside in the perimeter. So that night, I was inside Camp Delta. I was in the camp. I was 35 to 40 feet away from the medical clinic. I had 3 guards, at best 25 meters away from the medical clinic. I had another guard directly in a tower, directly looking at Camp 1, the walkway in Camp 1. I had a total of 7 guards that had they could visually see Camp 1 and the medical clinic and had a clear, unobstructed view. And none of those guards were interviewed by NCIS.
None of those guards were interviewed, the ones who were able to see whether the prisoners were taken away?
The tower guards, the eyes in the sky, none of them were interviewed. The guards that were posted just across the street from the medical clinic, none of them were interviewed. They would be the first one you would interview. And for them to say that I was a perimeter guard, it threw a lot of people off, and that's where the criticism came from. And I don't blame the people that criticized me, because they're taking their word. But I also think that the thing is being the unique position I had, where I was in the camp and outside the camp on certain duties, it gave me an even more it gave me a better position to even tell what was going on, because I could leave Camp Delta and see where that van was going. I could go inside of Camp Delta and see the detainees being loaded into the van. The position actually was beneficial, not how they tried to explain it.
Well, Joseph Hickman, you first.
Oh, sorry. Yes. One of the important things about the statement, because they were critical of Joe and of our report, one of their critical statements was that where Joe was, he couldn't see into the cells. And that's really a very disingenuous statement, because Sergeant Hickman never said he could see into the cells. What he said was he was standing by the clinic where if they had been brought from the cells, found dead hanging in their cells, they would have had to walk within 10 yards of him. And he, in fact, so he was in a place to show the bodies were never brought into the clinic from the camp.
Well, Joseph Hickman, when you first, when you noticed these discrepancies, you took them first to the Department of Justice. How did they respond to your concerns about what happened that night?
I met two FBI agents, and I met an attorney from two attorneys from the Department of Justice at Seton Hall Law School, with my attorney Josh Dembo and Professor Mark Dembo. And we sat and spoke for about 3 hours. They seemed very interested in what happened. They asked a lot of questions, and I was really encouraged by their interest in what I was telling them.
Joseph Hickman, who was your favorite president?
Ronald Reagan.
And you were the first officer on the camp to have soldiers open fire on the prisoners during an uprising among them?
Yes, I'm a sergeant. I'm actually enlisted. I'm not an officer, but yes, I was the first. I was the first one to ever give the order to fire on detainees.
Did your view of the camp change, or of the prison change? How did it change in that year that you were there?
Well, it's a big culture shock when you get to Guantanamo the first time and you're overseeing detainees and you're seeing how they live. It was a difficult, uncomfortable place to be. And you look down, you first get there and you see these detainees housed in these 6x8 cells, and you know they've been there for years, living in these cells for years, getting 1 hour rec time a week. You know there's some serious human rights issues. And it did affect me, and it was the first place I was ever stationed that, you know, every soldier takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. It was the first duty station I was ever at where I actually started questioning, was I breaking my oath?
And Mark Denbo, from the investigations that you've done on what happened that night, do you have any sense of, you know, were these people, the 3 detainees who died, were they deliberately targeted, or was it an experiment gone wrong?
Well, I guess the answer is I don't know. I mean, 3 people died under circumstances that were different from the investigative report. I think probably the closest I can get to is trying to figure out what the motive would be for these cover-ups and these false statements. And I think my own view is a legitimate investigation into what would have caused their deaths and answered your question. You know, was it deliberate, was it accidental? Would apparently have revealed a great deal of other activities that were taking place in Guantanamo that would have been something that our administration at that time would never have wanted to be revealed. They certainly wouldn't have wanted to show that Guantanamo was an intelligence operation, not a detention facility. I've always wondered why they would bring 779 of the most dangerous people in the world closer to the United States. And of course, it turns out that the answer was it was part of this program that began with marching orders directly from President Bush. So I've concluded that we don't know why or how they died by an experiment or otherwise, but an investigation into that would have answered that question, but it also would have revealed things that General Dunleavy and General Miller inadvertently revealed later on.
And Sergeant Joseph Hickman, you knew at that time that prisoners were taken away from where you were if they wanted to break them or turn them to be CIA assets, is that right?
I did not know that at the time. I did occasionally see detainees transported prior to June 9th to Camp No, but I didn't know at the time that they were doing that operation.
And so what have you come to conclude right now? about what this prison represents. You know, one of the recordings that's come out in the horror that took place in Paris was Koulibaly, the man who opened fire in the kosher supermarket. Speaking, sort of ranting in the supermarket because a reporter called up and he picked up the phone, thought he hung it up, but they were able to record what he was saying. He referred to ISIS, he referred to Iraq, and he also said, it was a little hard to understand, but stop unveiling our women, stop putting our brothers in prison for everything and anything. What Guantanamo has come to represent. In the United States, they're using it to say we can never close it now, especially Republicans who are against the closure of Guantanamo, because we need it for terrorists. But what you now see, it's come to represent in the rest of the world.
Well, it makes, I mean, we pride ourselves on human rights, and this is ridiculous. We have a place that breaks so many human rights. It's ridiculous. I don't think there should be a Guantanamo. I think people should be charged for crimes, but I think it should be here in the United States.
Do you think Guantanamo threatens our national security?
Yes. I think it breeds terrorism.
In what way?
Well, I think the recidivism numbers I think are wrong that they come out with. But if you take a guy that was sent to Guantanamo off of a bounty from another tribe, and he sits there for 10, 12 years, his family comes to hate the United States. He himself hates the United States. When he gets out, how are these people going to respond to what we did to him?
Last question is about another prisoner, the prisoner whose name Shakar Amr. It happened the same night. It happened on June 9th, 2006. His attorney, Zachary Katznelson, described the torture of Amr in a federal filing. Scott Horton excerpted the statement. He said, Amr was beaten for 2.5 hours straight. 7 naval military police participated in his beating. Amr stated he'd refused to provide a retina scan and fingerprints. He reported to me he was strapped to a chair, fully restrained at the head, arms, and leg. The military police inflicted so much pain, Mr. Amr said he thought he was going to die. This is the same night as the other 3 prisoners died. Do you know about this?
Yes. I obtained a document, actually. And the detainee, Shakar Amr, if you notice in the affidavit, there is a lot of similarities to the 3 that did die. There was a mask put on his face. There was it was a lot of similarities, blockage of the airway, several things. It was pretty shocking when we discovered that.
I want to thank you for being with us. Is there any last statement you'd like to make, having written your book, Murder at Camp Delta, having served at Guantanamo, in light of what has taken place now in the world? Joseph Hickman speaking to us from Green Bay.
Well, I'd just like to say that I wrote this book so the truth could come out, and if people will notice, I dedicated it to Khalil al-Zurani. It is the father of one of the detainees who has always questioned the U.S. government's version of what happened that night. And I hope in some way this answers some questions and in an odd way give him some peace so he knows the truth.
Joseph Hickman, thanks so much for being with us. Former Army Staff Sergeant stationed at Guantanamo from March 2006 for the following year. He's just written a book called Murder at Camp Delta, a staff sergeant's pursuit of the truth about Guantanamo Bay. And Mark Dembo, thanks for being with us, professor at Seton Hall University School of Law, director of the Center for Policy and Research, co-author of the new report, Guantanamo, America's Battle Lab. We'll link to it at democracynow.org. When we come back, a remarkable story of a doctor in Amsterdam who decides to challenge laws against abortion around the world to protect women's reproductive rights. She takes to the high seas. Stay with us. Boudica Bayenya here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
The new U.S. Congress opened last week with the largest Republican majority in the House since the 1940s. Within a few days, lawmakers in both congressional chambers had already introduced 5 bills to restrict abortion access, including a ban on abortion after 20 weeks of pregnancy. At the state level, Republicans have taken control of a historic number of legislative chambers and announced efforts to roll back abortion access and cut funding for women's health. Amidst an unprecedented wave of state-level restrictions, the group NARAL Pro-Choice America has released its report card on women's reproductive rights. It gave the United States a D.
We turn now to a new film that looks at how a Dutch doctor managed to open access to safe abortion in countries where it's illegal. The film is called Vessel. It follows Dr. Rebecca Gompertz, who founded Women on Waves and set sail on a ship to provide abortions in international waters where a country's abortion bans don't apply. As they sailed from port to port, Women on Waves faced both deep gratitude from women seeking abortions and aggressive attempts to stop them. In this trailer, you hear some of the anti-choice protesters who gathered at ports in countries like Poland, where they chanted, "Welcome, Nazis," at Women on Waves, and Spain, where opponents actually used a rope to try to tow the group's vessel out to sea. But first, you hear the voice of Dr. Rebecca Gompertz.
It all started when I was working as a ship's doctor in countries where abortion was illegal. I'd seen a lot of women brought in because of illegal abortions. I could not observe that and just let it happen. So we built a mobile clinic so we could sail to international waters and legally help the women with a safe abortion.
To the harbor! We are here in solidarity with women who have been denied their human rights.
The police will come, let people board the ship.
The issue is, do women have really a basic human right to be able to decide what is happening with their own bodies? The ship is a symbol of freedom, has always been. It's so clear, if you speak to women, what is really at stake and what's happening and why.
Do you think Ms. I'm scared I will die. Can you really help me?
We're joined now from Amsterdam by Rebecca Gompertz, the Dutch doctor who founded Women on Waves and more recently founded Women on Web, an online support service that helps women obtain and safely take medications to induce abortion. And Diana Witten joins us here in New York. She's director of Vessel, which has been showing here in New York at the IFC and at community screenings around the world. It's also on sale on iTunes, and she's worked on this for, what, 7 years? Tell us the premise of Vessel. It's an astounding story.
Well, Vessel follows Rebecca's work over the past 10 years, basically, 13 years, from this wild idea that she had to use the offshore space construct to give abortions on a ship at sea. And it traces the evolution of their organization and all of the antagonists that came its way that they alchemized to strengthen the project and make it the sustainable organization that it is today.
And Dr. Rebecca Gompertz, can you talk to us about that? Tell us how you came to learn that abortions on international waters would make abortions legal, even for people from countries where abortion is illegal.
Thank you so much, Amy. At the time, I was a ship's doctor at Greenpeace, at Rainbow Warrior, and we were sailing to South America, and it were environmental issues that we were working on. And when I was there, I talked with doctors and women about abortion, because I was being trained as an abortion provider as well. And it was actually these stories that I shared then with the crew, and then the crew said, you know, if you have a ship, you could take these women into international waters, which is 12 miles offshore, and you could help them with a safe abortion if the ship is registered under Dutch flag. So it was the idea of the crew at that time, with the crew that I sailed with Greenpeace. And I decided to investigate it because I thought it was a very interesting idea. And so that is how it started.
I want to turn to what happened when Women on Waves tried to sail to Portugal and warships were sent out to meet you. This is Rebecca Gompertz in the film Vessel.
When the ship was on its way, I was already in Portugal. In the middle of the night, I got a phone call from the ship's captain that the Portuguese government had sent 2 warships to stop the ship from sailing into international waters.
This is Portuguese warship, Figueira da Foz. What are your intentions concerning your nav plan? Over.
That's a Portuguese warship demanding the navigational plans of the Women on Waves ship. Dr. Gompertz, talk about what happened in Portugal.
Well, when the ship was on its way to Portugal, the Minister of Defense, who was a fundamentalist, religious, right-wing minister, he claimed that the ship was violating the security of the state of Portugal, and he sent a fax to the ship that they were not allowed to enter the port. And at the same time, they sent warships to prevent the ship from sailing in. So it was interesting because in that it was so unprecedented because it's a European ship, and Europe has all these agreements that you cannot just block the ship of a friendly nation to enter your ports. So it became an enormous scandal. The European Union, there were debates in the European Union. The Dutch Minister of Foreign Affairs had to intervene. And, well, in the end, it didn't solve the situation because the ship couldn't sail in. But we challenged this decision of the Portuguese Minister of Defense in the European Court of Human Rights, and we won that case. So it has been rectified in the end. But I think what was interesting as a result of this action of the Minister of Defense is that there was such an enormous debate in Portugal, and one of the results of this was that the Portuguese government fell, and the most important issue on the new elections that were taking place 2 or 3 months later was the legalization of abortion, and abortion was legalized in 2 years after that. So I think it had an enormous impact because it showed so clearly that the Portuguese people had a very different opinion on whether women or not can have access to safe abortions.
And this is a clip of Women on Wave's first trip, the one that you took to Ireland. Again, this is Dr. Rebecca Gompertz responding to a question from a reporter who asked her if she'd ever had an abortion herself.
It's a personal experience. Don't try. It's too easy. All these hundreds of people that are involved, they are all doing this with their heart and not because they had an abortion. I mean, are you going to ask somebody working for Amnesty International whether they have been tortured? Come on, that's not the issue. The issue is, do women have really a basic human right to be able to decide what is happening with their own bodies?
Dr. Gompertz, later in the film, you actually reveal on a Portuguese talk show that you did have an abortion, and that, in fact, at that time on the talk show, you were pregnant. Can you talk about the decision to speak out about your own experience, about your abortions, and also about your children?
Well, I think that one of the main reasons why abortion is still so restricted is because of the enormous taboo and the shame that comes with it. So I think that coming out is a very important part of the struggle to legalize abortion and to, let's say, to normalize it, because abortion is a very common event. I think 1 in 5 women in the Netherlands has an abortion, and the Netherlands has one of the lowest abortion rates in the world. So I think that for me, what was the problem at the moment that this question was asked in Ireland was that it was the first campaign. It was very tense, and I thought it was not fair to just to diminish an effort like that of so many people to a kind of psychologizing it, like, oh, she had an abortion, that's why she did it, because, you know, like me, there's a lot of other women that have had abortions in their life, and I wish that all of these would have become abortion rights advocates. At the moment in the talk show in Portugal, something else was the matter. I had done something quite extreme. I had shown to the public how women can do an abortion themselves with the medicines Cytotec, misoprostol, and at that moment, there was this man from the anti-abortion rights man that was attacking me. And I don't know, I mean, a lot of these decisions are intuition. It's not like, you know, I planned this ahead. But I think at that point, it was a very good moment because it also kind of neutralized the very outspoken act of actually putting abortion in the hands of women themselves, which I had done just before by explaining how they can use these medicines.
Diana Whitten, we only have a minute. You've done this remarkable film called Vessel. Can you talk about the use of these 2 pills? I don't think that many people in the United States know about them as a use for abortion, and how they're used in the United States.
In the United States, medical abortion is offered in Planned Parenthood and other health clinics, so it is an option here in the States. It's a 2-pill regimen that's most highly effective. In most of the world where abortion is illegal, the second pill can be used on its own to induce abortion.
And that pill is?
That pill is called misoprostol. And one of the things that Vessel does is contextualize that pill and give it some global context. It also, the film serves as a bit of a Trojan horse for information about how to find and take that pill. Similarly to what Rebecca's referring to when she went on Portuguese television, the film has a segment where we describe the pill, and it shows providers and women around the world using that pill.
And Women on Web is providing that information. Quite astounding. It used to be that women from Mexico would come up to the United States to get an abortion in Texas. Now women in the United States are going to Mexico to get the pill?
That's right. Yeah, the landscape has changed so dramatically here in the past few years.
Well, we're going to continue this conversation and post it online at democracynow.org. It is a remarkable film. It's called Vessel. Diana Whitten is the director. You can find out more about the film and how to host a community screening at vesselthefilm.com. Rebecca Gompertz has been our guest from Amsterdam, a Dutch doctor who founded Women on Waves and Women on Web. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Our website's democracynow.org.